Welcome to the Aspen Institute's Criminal Justice Reform Initiative's webinar, Breaking the Record, New Job Pathways for Returning Citizens. This webinar is part of the Rework Reentry initiative, a collaboration between the Aspen Institute and Slack to promote the hiring of returning citizens in the tech industry and beyond. We are pleased to have several distinguished guests on our panel today to discuss this critically important topic. And I'd like to remind everyone to please submit your questions in the Q&A area. Let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Angela Collier, Director, Culture, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Walmart. Sandra Gaddy, CEO of Women's Resource Center in Grand Rapids. Brandon Johnson, Director of Policy, Division of Social Justice and Equity, City of Birmingham. And Jeffrey Korzenik, author of the book, Untapped Talent, How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and Community. Welcome to all of you. It's great to have you on the panel today. So let's start off with this first question, which I think is a question that we've thought about quite a bit. Why is this important? We know that 500,000 people return to communities every year, and they return mostly to communities of concentrated disadvantage, and some researchers would reflect structural predicates of racial segregation. So why is it important to do this?
You know, I'm going to jump in, Doug, if I could, and start out with the simple business perspective that all of us have a vested interest in this, because our economic growth is contingent on being able to grow our labor force, and we have a structural labor shortage. And one of the answers has to be making sure that everyone who is able to work and wants to work not only has the opportunity for a job, but the ability to contribute and grow their skills to the extent of their capability. So there's obviously a moral imperative, but there's also an economic imperative.
That's right. I'll add on there. At Walmart, we really concentrate on what we call shared value. And that's where we think about the needs of the communities that we're trying to serve, the needs of our business as a retailer, and how do we bring those two together to create transformative and sustainable change. And because there are individuals who are coming out of incarceration who need employment, we have open roles that are available to be filled. It creates a win-win solution that doesn't go away, right? You're going to always have someone who needs a job, and we're going to have jobs to fill. And so it makes sense from a business imperative to make sure that we match up and create a sustainable solution for those who need it.
And from a city perspective, I think it's twofold. One, in a global economy where cities are competing across the world, and the number one factor of competition is population, we can't afford to lose population. And then the other side of that is there is a moral imperative. As public servants, we serve everybody that is a resident of our city. And so once you have quote unquote paid your debt to society, our obligation to serve you is no less than any other resident. So we have an obligation to meet the needs of the residents that have been impacted by the justice system, just as we do any other resident of the city.
Sandra, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, and sharing from an organizational nonprofit position, we just believe it's really critically important that women in particular, because we're a women's-based organization, but all inmates are served prior to release. So the way we serve the women is 90 days before they are released from jail. We are providing the mentoring, workforce development, one-on-one career coaching opportunities. And then once released, then we're still working with them with those same opportunities up to 18 months after their release. It's important that that mentorship happens along with that coaching to provide them the opportunity to work hand in hand with a community member that will help them connect to additional resources after they are released from jail, but beyond just the organizational position with our career coaches that are working alongside them.
I want to talk a little bit about that. When we talk about what happens inside prisons, it's important to think about creating this pathway so that there's that support when they get back in the community. So let's talk about some of the challenges of reentry.
Well, in particular for women, there's a number of barriers to their success. We have job entry, and when you're applying for jobs, for instance, women are 75% likely not to get a call back. If you're a woman of color, that only increases for job applicants. But you also have the barriers of the traditional barriers of housing, transportation, food insecurity. But a barrier that we don't often think about is family reunification and moms seeking to get their children back. And that's a tremendous barrier for these women as they're trying to get employment along with housing and transportation, but also to reunify with their children if their children have been taken away because of the particular charge that they have. So there's a number of barriers, but one of the barriers that we really try to work intentionally with the employers in West Michigan. We serve Kent County, Ottawa County, and Muskegon County now. Working closely with employers, we've all worked with employers in trying to ban the bots. That's one. But once they're working and they are employed, it's really important if employers can work hand in hand with some of the organizations that are working with returning citizens.
Any additional thoughts on that, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I'll second the importance of working with organizations, because from an employer's standpoint, there's just so many barriers that people who have a conviction, whether they've been incarcerated or not, it's obviously made worse with incarceration, have. And if you look across regulations at the municipal level, the state level, the federal level, other jurisdictions, and you look at those across the country, there are over 40,000 such what are called collateral consequences, and they can range from access to housing to access to other sorts of benefits, including health benefits, access to transportation. And then all of these formal regulatory barriers are compounded by the deeper barriers of extreme poverty, intergenerational poverty, often lack of mentorship. So there is a very, very large mountain that people have to climb to be job ready and job capable. The flip side of that is the people who have climbed that mountain are people of great determination, and employers who have identified those who've overcome all those barriers have found that these are exceptional employees because they've proven their determination. Now, we can all do better in lowering many of those barriers, but we should also recognize that the people who have gone through those are truly exceptionally capable people.
I think you have to think about this issue first and foremost in the context of recidivism, right? So first and foremost, you're trying to prevent recidivism. In that context, some of the factors that we look at are health, of course, employment, housing, skill development, which is very important depending upon how long somebody has been incarcerated, the cultivation of social networks, to the point that Sandra made about family reunification, and then building NGO capacity. Something that we don't often talk about is navigation is probably the greatest barrier that a lot of these individuals will face. And it's navigation of the systems that are supposed to be serving them. And I bring up NGO capacity because ultimately it's the community-based organization that has to walk these people through these systems, but they don't have always the capacity to deal with the numbers that we're placing upon them. And so one of the things that Mayor Woodfin has tried to do with his administration in our office is, as advocates within government, help to simplify some of that navigation. You know, it's not just the regulatory barriers that are set up and policies and laws that need to be changed, but even knowing where to go and knowing everybody that is affecting you and that you need to answer to is a really borders or is an undue burden on the returning citizen.
And, you know, we didn't even talk about the debts, the financial burdens people can come out
Fines
with,
and fees,
which might be, yeah, fines, fees, restitution, child support payments. And, you know, people start out in the hole financially already. It becomes very hard to stabilize, or becomes much more tempting to go back to ways they might have made money before that are what got them in trouble in the first place.
And some of that starts while they're in, well, most of it starts while they're in jail. When you think about just being able to access commissary, right? And when you're looking at needs for women, they often have to, unless we're advocating for them to get these services free, but sanitary napkins, for instance, and paying for underwear in some jails. In Kent County, that was something that women had to pay for at one point. Now, through some one-on-one support and collaboration and policy changes at Kent County Jail, that is no longer so, thanks to our sheriff there. But so many of them, it is such a barrier for our returning citizens as they're coming out, and accessing legal services for them, like you were just saying, Jeff, with getting their children back. They simply cannot afford to pay for any of those services that they need.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing. I think mentorship, and it's been kind of hit on a couple of times, that's such an important part of the wraparound services. Obviously, housing and childcare and all those things are important, but some of those soft skills that maybe are a bit rusty, depending on how long they've been incarcerated, it's really important to provide that. We've heard stories of individuals just not knowing how to reintegrate into the workforce. And so being able to have that mentorship has been really important and impactful, and helping to make sure that they understand how to deal with difficulties on the job, who can they go to and talk to if they have questions about advancing their career. And so mentoring has been a really big portion, in addition to some of the other things that the other panelists have talked about.
and I would second that, and maybe even put a finer point on this so that we are not missing a lot of the points here. As a resident of the state of Alabama, which is currently under federal investigation or being sued by the Department of Justice for violation of the 8th Amendment, cruel and usual punishment by virtue of the circumstances in the prisons, we have to recognize that a lot of these individuals, if not the majority, are coming out traumatized, right? Highly traumatized. And so it's the mentorship and the reacclimation to society is very much necessitated by the level of trauma experienced. And one of the things that we found that is lacking, but is very necessary, is that trauma is very much visited upon the person based upon who they are and their identity. Your race, your gender, your age, the type of crime you committed, which usually influences where you were incarcerated, the community you're returning to, your resources before you left, are all factors in how resilient you are and what level of trauma that you're able to overcome or that you're faced with. And so as we deal with this population, recognizing that these are largely traumatized individuals, we have to have a trauma-informed approach in terms of how we reincorporate them into our communities.
So let's get to some specifics. How do you get started setting up employment opportunities for returning citizens in the private and public sector? And then we'll delve down even deeper on the structure necessary to support returning citizens in their employment.
I'm sorry to jump in, but I think if I were a business owner listening to this or business decision maker, I would be a little intimidated. And actually that's okay, because this is more than just giving someone a shot, right? It requires a very intentional approach. And you are talking about a population that has not had the same life experience that most hiring managers and most executives have had. That doesn't mean that they're going to be bad employees. In fact, there's all sorts of evidence that suggests that done right, they're exceptionally good employees and that you're paid back for this investment, but you have to make an investment. And to make that kind of commitment, it has to start at the top. So if you don't have, this is something that's very difficult to be done at, initiated by a mid-level employee. This has to have executive buy-in. And not only that, executives have to make it some level of priority where they expect accountability. And that's the starting point for a lot of other things that have to happen.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. So absolutely, having that champion at the top is so critical, Jeffrey. Also, we know what we have expertise in, and wraparound services is not one of them. And so, we know that this is not work that we can do alone. So we bring in community partners who have expertise in the various areas that we're trying to approach. So for example, we have partners who specialize in training for tech jobs once they are released from incarceration. We have others who are training for frontline roles. And so we are meeting with the individuals in the communities that have the specific skill set that we're trying to bring into our workforce. And then making sure that those organizations have selection criteria, making sure that they have wraparound services, making sure that if the individual needs help with the application process, that they're able to do all of those things. And so back to some of the things that Brandon was talking about around capacity building and making sure that we're not accidentally breaking an organization because we're asking them to do something that's outside of the scope for which they work is really important. But I think bringing those community partners along into kind of our ecosystem to make sure that we are doing the right thing by those individuals who are returning to society, in addition to filling headcount that we have available.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also just share that individually, for individuals going to work, having that individual employment plan developed that can be shared with the employer, especially those in HR, will be critically important, because it will allow and facilitate a process by which a coach can do a monthly check-in with that employer. And we see that as so beneficial, in addition to the partners that come around that employee. But pre-entry into the community, having a pre-reentry plan with mental health specialists, with their officer, their PI officer, and the coach, bringing all these people together to find out how do we help facilitate success before they re-enter into the community so that we can streamline as much as possible for them. But really working hand in hand with the employers will be really, really critically important.
And I think it is worth, particularly for employers, to do some assessment of the system you're dealing with. So that's kind of where we're starting is, and we're assessing what the system is offering, advocating for some accountability, but kind of starting where they are. So we have work release in our penal system. We have trades training in our system. So also looking at what assets are they coming to the table with? And in terms of pre-release, if they have work release, when can we engage and how early can we engage this population to prepare them for post-release? And then this is something that I wouldn't say it's controversial, but something we don't talk about. A good number of incarcerated persons are already well integrated into a lot of corporate structures. They are already working for corporations while they're incarcerated. Many call centers and a number of things are already operating behind the walls of prisons, both private and public. It's just that they don't get credit for those job skills when they leave the confines of those prisons. So if we're better able to identify the type of work and job skills that they've developed and build our reentry plans and support networks around that, we'll find we already have highly skilled persons that are just looking to put their skills to work in the free world.
Doug, can I broaden this out a little bit? We've been
Sure.
talking mostly about people who are currently in prison. So we have about 1 million people plus in prison, another million in other forms of incarceration right now in the United States. But we have 19 million people who've been convicted of a felony. So from a workforce, potential workforce, this is a huge group. And all sorts of people are in different levels of readiness. Some people have been working for 10, 20 years, have completely reestablished themselves, and they're just another employee, yet they're going to be barred from opportunities in many companies because of the structure of how any criminal record is assessed. And so employers can really do themselves a favor by looking at the whole range of barriers that they have perhaps unwittingly put into their system. And I'll give one example because I think it's something that any businesses listening, employers listening can take away. Somewhere in there, whether you are in a ban the box state and you find out a criminal background check later, or you ask someone to check a box in advance, if for a serious candidate, someone is going to be evaluating that application and that record. All too often, the person or the committee that does that evaluation has no career incentive to ever say yes to that candidate. And so part of the structures that companies have to develop to access the broad talent pools they're going to need is finding out where they have unwittingly put in barriers. And that's one of them. There are all sorts of rules or regulations, but the most critical one that I keep coming across is companies will say, oh yeah, we consider everyone, but then where the rubber meets the road in that evaluation, it's a stacked deck against those candidates.
Just to go off of Brandon, and then I want to comment on what Jeff said. Brandon was talking about our inmates who are currently in prison or jail and who develop skill sets. So I was at a Michigan convening in Lansing a few weeks ago, and a gentleman was sharing that he received a culinary certificate while he was in prison. He cannot use that culinary certificate outside because while in prison, they didn't have access to knives. And so by streamlining and helping inmates have a pre-entry plan ahead of time, we can identify services and scholarships and programs available to them that's in their local community, that this gentleman, there's no reason why he shouldn't have been able to go to his local community college or a culinary school to be able to take advantage of the fullness of a culinary certificate. Now he's been out for 2 years and have not accessed that. So I think that's a huge miss for reentry for these inmates and these returning citizens. Jeffrey was talking about employers, and I think there are some employers that are really doing it well. I know in our community here in Greater Grand Rapids, we have Cascade Engineering and Butterball Farms. I'm a firm believer in not reinventing the wheel. Why not find out in your community what companies are doing it well and duplicate what they're doing? And so having those companies already in place that can help other companies and walk alongside them will be hugely beneficial for any community that really want to do reentry brilliantly.
So if you're an executive or both in the public and private sector, what are the human resources and legal issues that must be considered when you're hiring a returning citizen and you want to hire a returning citizen?
The starting point, I think, is probably, do you have actual regulatory barriers? So for instance, in the defense industry, there may be federal barriers. You're not allowed to have people employed on projects. You might have in financial services, you have people you're not allowed to hire, or offenses which disqualify individuals. I will say that many companies that live in that regulatory environment believe the barriers to be greater than they are. For instance, I'm in financial services. I always thought you couldn't hire someone with a criminal record. Well, it turns out you can. But there are exemptions. There's a pathway for people who don't meet those exemptions to be granted an exemption. So it's a starting point is finding the no-goes there. And then I think there are some practical no-goes, people who are who might be convicted of offenses against children. You don't want to be in a place where you might violate laws. So people who are on the sex offender registry can't often work in proximity of schools. So there's all sorts of actual regulations that you have to know where your starting points are. But generally speaking, companies have much more latitude than they believe they have. And it becomes a matter of then assessing what's appropriate. So how the EEOC, of course, has set up very good guidelines for how you assess a criminal record. What was the nature of the offense? How old was the person at the time they committed the offense? How many years have passed? All of those things, and what's the nature of the crime conviction versus the nature of the role are all part of that. And then there are broader issues like negligent hiring liability is on the minds of many businesses. Are they opening themselves up to financial liability? All of these things have to be addressed. You can't pretend they don't exist. And yet, like to Sandra's point, there are lots of great companies that have figured this out. And so these are barriers, but they're not insurmountable barriers.
Absolutely. And sometimes it starts with a conversation internally, right? So you have this perception of, to Jeffrey's point, who you can and can't hire. But if you have those internal conversations with those who are doing, for example, in our world, a circumstance review, and understanding what are they looking for when they, get past the background check, and if they don't pass that background check and they go into circumstance review for our organization, what does that look like? What are they looking for? What are some of the things that are, really hard to get past? And then really start thinking about, as an organization, who can we serve? And then double down, right? So there will be individuals that you just can't hire depending on the industry that you're in. But for those that you can, that's where you lean in. There's some things that you really, from a regulatory standpoint, you can't do anything about. But for those ones where you do have leverage, that's where you say, okay, that's where we're going to lean in. That's where we're going to put all our efforts. And then you learn. We have learned a lot about our process just through, banning the box many years ago. That's been, off of our applications for many years, even before it was, a question kind of in the ether. But then as we looked at our application process, how do we make that easier? What are some things that we're asking that are unnecessary? Which means when we fix it for those who are returning citizens, we actually fix it for everybody. It's kind of like this curb cut effect. The curb cut was never intended for me, but when I was a young mom, I used it all the time with my child's stroller, right? But it was never for me. And so we look at our work in the same way. When we fix it for those who are returning citizens, we fix it for a lot of other people, and we make job accessibility and application process easier for all. And so it really is about, what can I do? and how can I kind of put my best foot forward on the things that I'm able to accomplish.
Any other thoughts on that question?
I would just share that when employers do have employees or an applicant that has applied and they just said, man, if it wasn't for that particular record, but they would love to hire him, I think it's really good if they help them access other employers that may be willing to hire with that offense, or even access services that are available in the community that will help them improve on their skill set to later be qualified for a position that they're currently not qualified for. Technical skills could be one of those, and especially if someone has been in prison a very long time, they may not have the technical skills to compete in some of the jobs. And so instead of turning them away, really helping them to access services, to be a good community partner for these and an ally for them.
So I want to address something else. So you set up the program, you have started to hire returning citizens. How do you build support among the staff in the organization? And then I'm going to follow that up after we address that. How do you support the person, the individual? And I want to consider what Brandon mentioned, particularly when it comes to individuals who have, suffered through a lot of trauma. So let's start with the first. How do you build support among staff within the organization or the company?
Yeah, I can start first. So it's interesting that you asked that question, because we actually would never tell side-by-side staff members that someone is a returning citizen. You'd never know. You could work along that person for years, and unless they told you, you wouldn't know. Now, there are people obviously who have a remit to do the circumstance review, do the background check. They know. But for example, if you were my colleague and you had been incarcerated, I wouldn't know unless you told me. Just because it takes a mental model shift for people to not have bias, I guess, against someone who is a returning citizen. And we never want to put an associate in a position where they're being judged for something that they've already paid their debt for. And so we actually wouldn't tell them. I can answer your other question in a bit, so I won't answer that one, but we wouldn't tell them.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I'll tackle sort of the corporate buy-in, getting buy-in. This is really not about hiring people who've committed a crime. This is about hiring people who've been marginalized from the workforce. And there are lots of other ways. So I think the buy-in message is, if a company, to Angela's point, companies that do this don't typically broadcast who has a record and who doesn't have a record, but sometimes they set up pilot programs where it becomes somewhat evident, who's coming in on the van from the halfway house, those kind of things. So the positioning is that if you're starting a program, we're starting a program to give opportunities to people who've been marginalized, and they might have been marginalized from multi-generational poverty. They might have been marginalized from past struggles with addiction. They might even have a criminal record. The point is that we are part of giving people opportunities to thrive. And this is a way that we can help ourselves and help our communities. And it's a broader message. And then the specifics of how you do it at, say, the executive level or the manager level, some of it is going and visiting those companies, going and visiting prisons. So seeing people as people, and then seeing businesses that have succeeded in this. So, Sandra had mentioned earlier, go find a company. I don't think every community has a company that does it well, but this is an investment in the future of your company. Go get it on an airplane. Go to Grand Rapids, which has a whole bunch of companies. Sandra mentioned several of them that do an exceptional job. The city of Cincinnati has exceptional companies doing this. It's short money compared to the kind of investment in a company's future. And that's often been a transformational moment that I've seen companies adopt second chance hiring because they saw it work somewhere else.
And I chuckled a little bit because I come from a different perspective, particularly working in a 70+% Black city. So I would suggest that this also becomes a litmus test for not just your culture of your company, but the diversity of your company. right? The level of tolerance around this speaks very much to who your workforce is and who you're hiring, right? So I think that to the point that serving this vulnerable population helps you fix other systems. If you are experiencing a corporate culture where there's a bias, a heavy bias, or a lack of tolerance for this type of person coming into your organization, it's probably a sign that you have other diversity and inclusion issues that you need to tackle as well.
Any other thoughts on that?
I just have to second what Brandon said, because here's the ugly truth of the American justice system. 1 in 3 Black men in America has a felony conviction, right? So if you don't have an on-ramp for people with criminal records into your company, you don't really have a full diversity program.
And I would just add that as you are bringing these individuals in, ensuring that they are fairly paid, and particularly looking at how women are fairly paid who are returning citizens, ensuring that they are not leveled down from other women, and they're certainly not leveled down from their male peers.
So why don't we continue with the question, that's a similar question, but on the flip side, which is, how do you support the person, the individual, in the process, not only when they're hired, but while they're there in the company or in the public sector?
Again, the partners that we have a long tail of support for the individuals. So you obviously have kind of the internal managerial support. You have mentorship and sponsorship, which are things that are just cultural norms, with our organization. But then you also have the wraparound services for very specific things, right? So, if transportation is needed or housing is needed, having that wraparound support continue past kind of, I've gotten you hired, now I fall off. So I loved hearing that Sandra said they go 18 months. We have some that follow them in a very longitudinal way past the 18 months, but giving that long tail so that they feel like they have this safety net and they haven't kind of been cut loose as soon as they're employed is really, really important.
And having that monthly check-in that I mentioned before with the wraparound services and working closely with partners, I really believe in the nonprofit sector, no one nonprofit can do everything. So we can't be everything to our participants. So it's important that we partner and that we partner well. And as we are partnering with corporations and these companies to help ensure the success of that return citizens, the monthly check-ins, the calls, and ensuring that HR, just an example of, you may have a participant or an employee that may not have shown up for 2 days. And just knowing, don't fire them, but call the employee and call the coaches of the nonprofit and say, what's going on? They could have childcare issues, they could have transportation issues, and because they are returning citizens, they may feel that they've lost their job immediately when they haven't. So it's just really important, just really working hand in hand with those community-based organizations to ensure that the reentry is successful all the way around.
And I think it comes down to it depends on the size of your workforce. The city of Birmingham is about a 4,000 person workforce. And so from our perspective, having a strong employee assistance program is a big thing that we can do, because whether or not you've been incarcerated, there are other demographics where your needs look the same as other employees. And so making sure that you're tailoring your employee assistance program to the needs of all your employees. Again, dealing with one vulnerable population tends to make it better for other vulnerable populations. And so you'll have a better program by recognizing those needs and find yourself serving your workforce better overall.
And I'll just underscore something that's been mentioned a few times by other panelists. It's not just having the services available, It's recognizing this population and other marginalized populations may not know how to navigate to those services. So coaches are key. Some companies I've studied have set up actual life coaches on the team. Or I know of a hospital system that just hired navigators to check in with people and help them navigate. There's a psychologist, social workers, all as part of for-profit companies. And they do that not for any other reason than it is a good investment in their human capital.
So Jeffrey mentioned this before, and we've all mentioned barriers, but what more needs to be done, both in the public and private sector, considering the fact that, as we said before, over 40,000 barriers on the books now, the majority relating to employment. So what needs to be done?
I'll throw a couple of policy changes that I see that have been very beneficial. One is clean slate initiatives, where people who may have been convicted of a single minor crime and a number of years have passed, and there's clearly no threat to public safety, instead of having to go through an arduous and sometimes expensive and time-consuming process, there's automatic expungement or at least sealing of those records. They're still typically available to law enforcement should they be needed, but you remove that stigma. There's also the issue of negligent hiring liability. Employers have trouble accepting risk that they can't quantify, and it's very difficult to quantify the risk that you might get sued if you hire someone who creates some kind of harm to your customers or to your workforce. And the reality is these are very rare occurrences. So if they're very rare occurrences, why aren't we offering more safe harbors for employers? This is done in certain states, Texas for one. You can hire people who've been convicted of certain crimes and not have any additional liability because there was a conviction in the past than you do for any other employee. So these are things that are easy to take off the table from a policy standpoint, and really actually end up increasing public safety, not taking away from public safety, but increasing public safety because they ensure better employment outcomes, which is foundational for rehabilitation and preventing recidivism.
I think one of the other things employers can do is really think about communities of practice. So how do we share what we're learning across our own particular industry, and quite frankly, with others who may be similarly situated like us, and be able to say, here are the missteps that we've made, so I can prevent you from having those same missteps, or here's what I've learned, or here's a sustainable model. But being willing to share that information, I think, will be really important to moving the space.
Any other thoughts on that?
I was at the convening I mentioned before, in one of the
Which convening was that, Sandra?
The state of Michigan convening in Lansing for reentry work. And one of the one of the returning citizens who has her own nonprofit now said, so often organizations or companies are creating things for us, but don't include us. And she said, so as you are looking at creating policies and creating programs, it needs to be with us, for us, and by us as well. So thinking about those employees that may be at your companies or within nonprofits, it's important to have their voice at the table, not forcefully, because some people just don't have capacity or desire, but if they are willing to share how to best serve them. We have an annual participant share event, and we're going to form a New Beginnings, which is our jails-based program, a New Beginnings council, where it's all formed by women who are formerly in our program and who are successful. So they will greater inform our work there. And we need to have that type of thing in place all around. And that's so important. And that really stuck with me.
Okay. Brandon, did you want to say anything?
I agree with everything that's been said. I know I'm the government person, so I should have a harder policy answer for this. but it really comes down to, I never want to underestimate or underplay just compassion, humanity, decency, which goes a long way. But there's a level of critical literacy and understanding that I think is needed in larger society, right? So I think if more people understood the criminal justice system as it functions and not as they have imagined it, I think there would be more energy to not just be more accepting and tolerant of persons that have been justice impacted, but more efforts and energy behind reforming some of these systems, because I think we can't lose sight of the fact that we are in a broken system that is has structural impacts and legacy impacts that are going to take generations to unpack.
Spoken like a true Morehouse man. So we have a lot of questions coming from the audience. So I want to jump into those if that's okay with everyone. And I'm just going to take them as they came in. So the first question is from Beth, a colleague of mine at Aspen Digital. What advice would you give to a company when it comes to successfully onboarding returning citizens and making them feel included and welcome? We touched a little bit on this, but any reinforcement in terms of what you said would be great in responding to this question.
I'll say one of our, cultural beliefs is respect for the individual. And it really does go a long way in helping people feel like they belong, because you're saying, they may never tell you that they were incarcerated, right? They may never tell you that they're a returning citizen, but the way that they come into the organization is really paramount in terms of whether or not they stay or depart. And so making sure that we're respecting them, making sure that we're providing them with what they need, whether that is basic healthcare or mentorship or sponsorship. I mean, and we've talked about these things, but making sure they have the same experience as everyone else and the same level of respect as everyone else. And if they come to you and say, I actually need more support, I need more help, we'll have those tools available through our community partners, but we also have something internally called Resources for Living. And it helps you do everything from care for an elderly parent to getting mental health services, to figuring out daycare for your kids. And so it's a program that's internal to our associates, but it's another layer of support that's over and above kind of what they would have received from the wraparound services, to let them know that like you can still be successful regardless of kind of life challenges that you have outside of what we call the blue walls of Walmart, right? But how do we make them feel like somebody else has your back?
And I would add to that, just being very deliberate and honest about what your company culture is and helping that person to enter it. I think a lot of corporations and long-term employees forget that they have a particular way of doing things, a culture that is how they do things, but it's not innate. It's what you do. So have some grace and some awareness that you have a culture that a person's going to have to acclimate to.
And if you have an HR system that is set up, because HR is going to know that this individual has a record, but if they are set up where they can help fulfill the goals that this individual have, ask them, what are their goals? Are they working on a plan with an organization, and to help walk alongside them to be really intentional. And you don't share, as Angela shared earlier, that this individual has a record, but you can certainly share that there's goals that this person is working on to really help them find success with the company.
So another question, audience questions. Sandra mentioned the term ban the box. Could she share more on how to show employers the benefits when they often only see risks?
Yeah, as we all share, this has been in place for many years, and Jeffrey often talk about the benefits of company. There's not a lot of people coming back to work, and we have this workforce of available individuals who are ready to work. And that is certainly a benefit. And it was mentioned just the opportunity to diversify your companies. There are so many benefits and bring different skill sets and different knowledge base into your companies. It's wide.
I'm going to distinguish, thank you, Sandra, for because I talk about ban the box because it comes up a lot. And it's important to distinguish between a government mandate of ban the box, which has not been a terribly successful policy, right? There's very little evidence that it works in some places, doesn't work in other places. But companies that are ready to be truly inclusive employers and cast the widest net for talent should voluntarily ban the box, because for many applicants have come to think of ban the box as a signal that employers are sending that if you have a record, you don't have a shot. And so it's important to send the signal that you are truly, as employer, open to this by not requiring disclosure up front. And in fact, you can take it farther. There are companies which are very specific in their language, and on a listing, just as companies will often say, we don't discriminate based on race or religion or creed, say we give fair opportunities to people with records, or to post these listings on job boards like honestjobs.co, which is one that's specifically targeting people with records. All of those are ways of signaling that you as an employer are truly open to fair consideration and giving people a shot at developing and applying their talents.
And it comes down to internal leadership, I would say. And one thing that I think is I've seen where these efforts are successful is where there's a close handshake between your legal department and your HR department, right? And they're on the same page. And I think there are also some qualifications that you need to be looking for in the personnel that you hire in your HR department if this is an initiative that you're going to undertake.
This is an embarrassment of riches. We have so many questions. Okay, so which is great. So thank you, audience. So here's the next question. What things can we do to influence the focus on recidivism? The goal of not returning to prison is a low standard for a population that is capable of so much more. Is there a way to raise the level of what is considered successful reentry? If the goal is autonomy and self-efficacy, the support that organizations provide can level up. I imagine recidivism will decrease as a side effect of success like this. Thoughts?
Yeah, I actually love this question, and this gives me a chance to brag a little bit. We have this educational opportunity called Live Better You, and every associate from day one, regardless of how you enter the organization, is eligible. It's 100% tuition-free, fee-free education, which means if you don't have your high school diploma, we will pay for you to get it. If you need college prep, we'll pay for you to get it. If you want an associate's degree, a first associate's degree, a first bachelor's degree, we'll pay for you to get it. And when you give someone first an opportunity to get a job, and then you give them an opportunity to upskill, and they can do it in certification, so cybersecurity certification, an actual college degree, and these are not piddly schools. You've got, heavy hitters, University of Arizona, Purdue Global. These are not kind of, schools that aren't heard of. When you give them an opportunity to expand, not just the ability to be employed, but to be upskilled, that makes a difference in people's lives. And then when you give them a chance to matriculate through the organization, it is a big deal. And when you hear the stories later on of people who say, someone took a shot on me, now I'm a store manager making 6 figures. That's a very different conversation than, can you just give me a job? I'm coming out of incarceration. Can you just hire me? And so that's the level of success that we hope for all of our associates, quite frankly, whether you're a returning citizen or not.
Like Angela, I'm gonna brag a bit on our New Beginnings program. It happens to be our 10-year anniversary this year, and we've served 580 women at the beginning of the year who transitioned, and 78% of them are employed, and we reduced the recidivism rate to 28% for those women who are in our program, compared to 62% of those who are not being served. That's critically important because the access to as Angela was sharing, technical training, scholarships that we're able to provide with them to them, and working and seeing things like trade. 2 years ago, we had close to 12 women get their trade certification in welding, CNC operations. So non-traditional roles that women don't ideally see themselves in, they're starting to see themselves in and going for those roles and getting paid well to do them. So programming like corporate structures that are in place like Walmart and New Beginnings, they're critically important for the success and keeping that recidivism rate lowered.
Brandon?
I'm conscious of time, so I'll be quick. You raised the bar on reentry by inclusion. And by inclusion, I mean, you need to use the data to see the population and include them in the aggregate. Quite often we govern and we make decisions by anecdote. And what that causes us to do is totally write off this population and not include them in the overall picture of what our society looks like. I think if you crunch the numbers, see what their struggles are, see what percent of the population they are, how they're connected to other aspects of your population, and use that as a lever to kind of raise your overall performance as a community, I think that's how you start to raise the bar. But it starts, and it sounds crazy, but we do not see people that have been incarcerated once they're out of jail. And we totally ignore what they've been through, though they are intimately woven throughout our society. So I think you raise the bar first by seeing them and including them in how you see the needs of your complete community.
Brandon said something earlier too about a level of literacy about the justice system. And, I think we tend to pick at the edges about trying to deal with these issues, but the core solution is when we have employers across the country in every geography, in every industry, look at this population as a true talent pool and as their current and future workforce, I think we'll get a lot better policies. And we have the opportunity, today, and this call is part of that, to start creating a virtuous cycle where we incorporate people into the workforce. This gives exposure to people who have traditional backgrounds, meeting people who have had non-traditional backgrounds, and realizing they're just our fellow human beings with different life experiences. And that's the start of creating a much better society and a better economy.
Any other last thoughts from our panelists that you want to reinforce, Brandon?
There are a lot, it's a very technical issue. There are a lot of legal and policy issues, but the first switch has to be in your ability to recognize the humanity of these individuals, right? There are a lot of head issues that we talked about, but ultimately this is a heart issue. And recognizing that these are not just your fellow residents and citizens, but these are human beings that are intricately tied to the success of all of us. So recognizing that, yes, there's policy and there's all these decisions, but I think if you can lead with your heart and start to see their humanity, the head issues will start to fall in place for you.
Very good. Any last thoughts, Sandra or Angela?
Yes, go ahead, Angela.
Oh, go ahead, Sandra.
I would just say, as you look at what your own personal desires are for yourself, for your family, empowering and equipping these individuals for success is really critically important, because those are the things that I want. And at the end of the day, I want to be able to take care of my family and take care of myself individually. And so ensuring that these individuals are, and they're part of the community, are financially sustainable in the work that they're doing. So equipping, empowering, ensuring that they have some financial success.
And Angela, you get the last word.
Awesome. I'm so inspired just by being on the panel with these individuals and just hearing the passion around ensuring that we have a plan to provide access to those returning citizens. You know, Walmart is proximate to 90% of America. So we see most of the communities on a day-to-day basis, whether they're shopping in our stores or living around our stores in the communities that we serve. And so we feel like, you know, shared value just makes sense from a business perspective. It makes sense for the communities that we serve. It makes sense for those individuals who need and want employment. And we're excited to be a part of this journey. We know that it's not for the faint of heart and we can't do it alone. So we're thankful for the Brandons and the Jeffreys and the Sandras who are helping make a difference, and the Dougs who are making a difference in the communities that we seek to serve. So I appreciate you having us here today to talk about our work.
Well, thank you all. You all have been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for taking time to share your expertise and your passion. I also want to thank all the audience members out there who have been watching us and who will watch us now on YouTube and afterwards. I also want to thank Slack for supporting this work, and also my colleagues at Aspen Digital. Take a look at Next Chapter, and they have great recommendations that Slack is doing to promote employment of returning citizens in the tech industry. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.